What if Yoda trained Jon Snow? Then the White Walkers stop being Westeros's only real apocalypse problem, because now the North has a leader who can see the dead coming, read living enemies clearly, and stop getting played by every smiling liar in a nice coat. That is the theory. Yoda changes Jon first, sure, but the reason that matters is because Jon sits right at the center of every major crisis in the story. The Wall, the wildlings, Daenerys, Cersei, the dead, the throne. All of it keeps running through this one sad, noble boy who keeps making good-hearted decisions with bad timing. Yoda would fix the timing. He would look at Jon and know immediately that the kid's not weak. He's just carrying too much guilt and calling it honor. So Yoda's first move would be to make Jon harder to shake, harder to bait, harder to shame. That sounds personal, but it turns political real fast. Because once Jon stops reacting from old pain, the whole map changes. At the Wall, he rises faster and cleaner. He stops wasting energy on little pride battles with men like Alliser Thorne and starts seeing the bigger system. The Night's Watch is underfed, underprepared, proud in all the wrong places, and one hard winter away from getting folded like cheap laundry. Yoda would make Jon understand that leadership is not just bravery with a speech afterward. It is reading fear before fear runs the room. That means Jon starts taking the White Walker threat more seriously, earlier, and with more structure. He would push for scouts sooner, better preparation sooner, stronger alliances sooner. And that changes everything, because one of Westeros's dumbest habits is waiting until the wolf is already in the kitchen, before somebody admits the door should have been locked. Then you get to the wildlings, and this is where Yoda really starts wrecking the old political logic of the North. Because the average lord in Westeros sees two categories: my people and future corpses. Jon, in the original story, grows out of that slowly. A Yoda-trained Jon gets there faster. Yoda would teach him that fear makes men draw stupid lines, and stupid lines get a lot of people killed when the dead start marching. So Jon would understand, earlier, that the free folk are not just enemies, with bad manners and rough furs. They are manpower, knowledge, families, fighters, people who know the land beyond the Wall better than any crow ever will. That means Jon starts building that alliance sooner. And every day he does that, the White Walkers lose ground before the war even officially starts. And brother, that is where the stakes get big. Because once Jon starts winning people over instead of just surviving them, now he becomes dangerous to everybody south of the Wall too. Why? Because Cersei cannot control a man like that. Cersei thrives on vanity, division, fear, and people being too petty to unite until it is too late. A calmer Jon who can actually read manipulation does not get dazzled by crowns, insults, or threats. He sees her game faster, he trusts her less. He walks into those meetings already, understanding that she would let half the world die if it bought her one more month on a chair. That matters later. Same thing with Daenerys. In the original timeline, Daenerys gets a lot of leverage because she arrives as power, beauty, dragons, and destiny all wrapped in one shiny package. Jon gets pulled into that storm partly because he respects strength and partly because he is tired, desperate, and trying to save the world with whatever tools show up. Yoda would not let him move like that. He would teach Jon to separate need from trust, to work with power without kneeling to it emotionally. So now Daenerys does not meet the same Jon Snow. She meets a man who can admire the dragons, respect the army, and still keep one eyebrow raised the whole time, because he knows wounded savior energy when he sees it. And that changes the whole political board. So the opening theory is not just Yoda makes Jon more emotionally healthy. Cool, great, nice. The real theory is that Yoda turns Jon into the one person in Westeros who can connect the threats correctly. The dead are the war. The wildlings are allies. Cersei is a delay tactic in human form. Daenerys is useful but dangerous. The North needs unity, not pride. And once Jon starts seeing the board that clearly, every kingdom around him starts getting dragged into a different future whether they like it or not. So once Jon gets to the wall with Yoda in his head, the first big thing that changes is simple. He starts taking the White Walkers seriously before everybody else is done laughing. That matters, because in the original story, half of Westeros treats the dead like an old bedtime story, until bodies are already getting back up with blue eyes and a personal attitude problem. A Yoda-trained Jon would not wait for that. He would feel early that this is the real war, not the throne, not who insulted who at court, not which lord got offended because somebody sat too close to the fire at dinner. The dead are the war, and Yoda would drill that into him fast. So Jon starts moving different at Castle Black. He still trains, still earns respect, still handles the little social nonsense with Thorne and the others. But now he's studying the wall like a system under stress. He sees the weak spots, the lack of planning, the bad communication, the fact that half these men are living on stale food, thin sleep, and old pride, which is not exactly a recipe for surviving the end of the world. And because Yoda would have taught him not to waste energy proving himself to insecure people, Jon rises faster. He doesn't get dragged into every petty challenge. He lets Thorne bark, lets the bitter men stay bitter, and keeps building trust with the ones who matter. Mormont would notice that immediately, because a calmer Jon is way more impressive than an angry Jon. One is talented, the other looks like leadership. Then the wildling piece comes in, and this is where the whole northern story starts shifting hard. Jon in canon learns that the free folk are human through experience, through pain, through living among them, through seeing kids, old people, hungry camps, real fear, real survival. A Yoda-trained Jon gets to that understanding faster, because Yoda would already teach him the difference between an enemy and a system. The free folk are not the true threat. They are people trapped on the wrong side of the real threat. That means Jon starts talking differently about them earlier. And brother, that would make a lot of black brothers at the wall real uncomfortable. Because fear loves easy labels. Wildlings bad is easy. We need these people alive if we want any chance against the dead is harder. Because now you're asking bitter men to think bigger than their grudges. Jon would push that line sooner, harder too. And because he's more disciplined, he'd do it with better timing. Less righteous speechifying, more practical logic. More, if they die out there, they join the enemy, and then you get to fight the same people twice. That kind of framing lands, especially with soldiers, especially in a place where everybody already knows they are underfunded, undermanned, and one disaster away from becoming frozen snacks. That would also change how Jon moves beyond the wall. He still links up with the free folk, still meets Mance, still sees how they live, but now he's processing all of it with way more clarity. He notices the hunger, the cold, the way children sleep in conditions that would make southern lords cry after one night. He notices how much of their violence comes from pressure and survival, not cartoon villainy. Yoda would make sure Jon understands that if you ignore those human details, you make stupid strategic decisions later. And while all of that is happening, the political consequences start building in the background. Because every step Jon takes toward uniting the Watch and the wildlings makes him more threatening to the Old Order. Men like Thorne hate him more. Traditional Northerners get suspicious sooner. rumors start moving faster, because anytime one man starts making too much sense in Westeros, somebody in power immediately gets a stomachache. That's just how the place works. The beautiful part is, Jon handles that better too. Yoda would have already taught him that leadership means being misunderstood for a while. So instead of reacting like every insult is a knife to the ribs, he starts absorbing pressure and moving anyway. That makes him feel older than he is. He starts carrying himself less like a wounded son of Winterfell, and more like a man who understands that if he loses focus, thousands die. And that is the deeper shift in Chunk 2. Jon is no longer just surviving the wall or earning his place in it. He is quietly turning the wall into the first line of a real resistance, one built on better information, broader alliances, and less ego. Which sounds nice until you realize what that means for everybody else. Because once Jon starts seeing the White Walkers clearly, seeing the Free Folk clearly, and seeing the Night's Watch clearly, the next thing he is going to do is look south. And when he does, he is going to realize the people fighting over the Iron Throne are not just selfish. They are about to get everybody unalived. Now the second Jon starts looking south, the whole theory gets bigger, because that is where he realizes the dead are not the only problem. Westeros itself is a problem. The politics, the pride, the old grudges, the little family beefs everybody treats like sacred scripture. All of that is helping the White Walkers more than any ice magic ever could. And a Yoda-trained Jon would see that much earlier. He would understand that the real weakness in Westeros is not lack of fighters. It is lack of clarity. Too many people with banners, titles, and expensive chairs, and not enough people willing to say, hey, maybe this petty nonsense can wait until after the apocalypse. So this is where Jon starts changing from a northern commander into something more dangerous, a man who can read the whole board. He starts sending words south sooner. He starts pressing the threat harder. He stops framing the dead as a northern problem and starts framing them as what they really are. A full continent problem that does not care about your housewords, your bloodline, or the fact that your uncle's still mad about a war from 30 years ago. That changes how he deals with Stannis too. In the original story, Jon respects Stannis, but never fully bends, and that mostly comes from instinct and honor. Here, he handles Stannis with way more precision. Yoda would teach him how to work with powerful people without getting swallowed by their agendas. So Jon does not just react to Stannis as a king with an army. He reads him as a useful force with limits. He sees the desperation, the need for legitimacy, the way Stannis treats duty like it is a religion with no joy left in it. Jon would know how to use that without getting owned by it. Same thing with Melisandre. Oh, she becomes a whole lot less comfortable around this version of Jon, because Melisandre thrives around mystery, insecurity, prophecy, and people who are desperate enough to let her weird fire visions run the room. A calmer Jon with Yoda in his head does not get dazzled by glowing necklaces and doom sermons. He listens, sure, but he keeps his hands on the wheel. He does not let prophecy become an excuse for sloppy thinking. That alone changes a lot. Because now, when people start projecting Messiah energy onto Jon, he is less likely to inhale his own myth, and more likely to ask, okay, but what is the actual plan? And that makes him better at the one thing Westeros keeps failing at, turning truth into action. Then the betrayal piece comes in, and this is where Yoda's training really pays off. Jon in canon gets done filthy by his own men because he moves ahead of their fear without really preparing for how ugly fear gets when it feels cornered. A Yoda-trained Jon would still try to bring the wildlings through. He would still know it is the right call, but but he would handle the resistance smarter. He would read the panic in the watch earlier. He would isolate the biggest threats earlier. He would stop assuming that because something is morally right, bitter, scared men will eventually clap and see the vision. Nah, Westeros has never worked like that. If anything, the more right you are, the louder the fools get. Yoda would teach Jon that too. So maybe the betrayal still comes, but it comes harder to pull off. Or maybe Jon sees it coming and survives it differently. Either way, this is where the timeline really slides. Because if Jon avoids getting sent to permadeath by his own co-workers, then his whole role in the North gets stronger, cleaner, and earlier. He does not lose time. He does not lose momentum. He becomes the rally point sooner. And if he does go down and gets brought back anyway, well, now we have a version of Jon coming back from the edge, with even less fear, less attachment to ego, and more certainty about what the real war is. That is bad news for everybody still playing little throne games, like the continent is not about to become a haunted freezer. And now we finally get to the huge political domino. Because once Jon survives betrayal, sees the dead clearly, and starts moving south with that calm, people stop reading him as that stark bastard with decent hair. They start reading him as something else, a leader, a serious one, the kind that makes allies stand up straighter and makes liars start rehearsing. And that means the next chapter gets real dangerous, because now Jon is heading toward the two women who can reshape the whole continent in opposite directions, Cersei and Daenerys. And this time, he is not walking in as some emotionally exhausted hero looking for help. He is walking in understanding that one of them will stall, one of them will tempt, and both of them can still get half the realm sent to the gulag if he reads them wrong. Now Jon finally gets south, and this is where Yoda's training starts paying off in the most dangerous way possible, because now he is dealing with the two people most likely to either save Westeros or drag it straight to the gulag with a speech and a nice outfit. Cersei first. Because Cersei is not powerful in the same way the White Walkers are powerful. She is powerful the way poison is powerful. Slow, petty, patient, and fully willing to watch the house burn if she gets to stand in the warm part of the room a little longer. In the original story, everybody keeps making the same mistake with her. They walk in, hoping reason will work, hoping evidence will work, hoping the giant wall of consequences outside her window will finally make her act like a grown woman, instead of a crown wearing grudge. Yoda would make sure Jon never makes that mistake. He would teach him that some people do not respond to truth. They respond to leverage. So when Jon deals with Cersei, he is much less idealistic and much more strategic. He understands right away that she would absolutely let the North freeze, let the dead roll through half the realm, and still lie about helping if it bought her one extra season on that throne. That means Jon would stop wasting emotional energy trying to appeal to her conscience, because that woman's conscience is somewhere under the floorboards collecting dust with old family photos. He would treat her like what she is, a delay. A dangerous one, but still a delay. And that changes the whole southern play. He focuses less on convincing her and more on building around her allies, around her enemies, around the simple fact that if one rotten queen refuses to cooperate, you better start making moves that leave her irrelevant. Then comes Daenerys, and this is where the theory gets really good. Because Daenerys is the opposite kind of danger. She is not cold and cynical like Cersei. She is hot, earnest, charismatic. She believes in her own story, and that is exactly why people around her keep letting things slide they should have questioned harder. Dragons, armies, beauty, confidence. A whole lot of "I was chosen for this" energy. That package can mess with people fast, especially people who are exhausted and desperate. Jon in the original story gets pulled toward her, partly because she is useful, partly because she is impressive, and partly because by that point, he is carrying so much pressure. He will work with almost anybody holding a weapon and a plan. A Yoda-trained Jon still works with her. He is not stupid. Dragons are dragons. But the emotional tone changes completely. He does not meet Daenerys like a tired man looking for rescue. He meets her like a leader evaluating another leader who could become either the best ally in the war or the next huge problem after it. That is a big difference. Yoda would teach him to separate attraction from trust, charisma from character, and destiny talk from actual judgment. So when Daenerys starts speaking in that "I will break the wheel" language, Jon hears the hope in it, but he also hears the danger, because Yoda knows something Westeros never learned. The people most convinced they are here to save the world are sometimes the fastest to burn it down when the world does not cooperate. That makes Jon way more balanced around her. He respects her strength. He sees the value in the dragons. He understands the military reality, but he never hands over his thinking. He watches how she reacts to defiance. He watches how she talks about power. He watches whether her mercy depends on obedience. And brother, those details matter. Because once Jon starts reading Daenerys that clearly, the whole North-South alliance becomes smarter. He can partner with her without getting spiritually recruited into her whole Destiny franchise. He can appreciate what she brings while still noticing the warning signs. And all the while, the White Walkers are still coming, which means the pressure is making everybody reveal themselves faster. Cersei reveals that she will always choose herself. Daenerys reveals that she wants to be loved, but will settle for being obeyed. Jon reveals something different. He can stand in the middle of fear, beauty, prophecy, politics, and everybody's giant emotional storms without getting pulled off center. That is what Yoda really gives him. Not magic speeches, center. And once a man like Jon has that, the question is no longer whether he can survive the politics of Westeros. The question becomes whether anybody else is ready for what happens when the one decent man in the room finally stops being the easiest one to manipulate. Now this is where the theory starts cashing every check it wrote earlier, because once Jon stops getting emotionally pushed around by every crown, prophecy, and sad story in the room, the final war in Westeros looks completely different. The battle against the White Walkers becomes cleaner, faster, and a whole lot less chaotic. Because this version of Jon does not wait until the last minute to force people into alignment. He has already been building toward this. He has already been warning people, already making alliances, already reading which lords are useful and which ones are just decorative furniture in expensive armor. So when the dead finally come south in force, Jon is not standing there like a brave man improvising in the apocalypse. He is standing there like a commander who saw this storm forming chapters ago. That changes how Winterfell gets prepared. More dragon glass gathered sooner, stronger coordination with the free folk, better use of scouts, better use of terrain, fewer ego-driven arguments, more clear roles. Yoda would have taught Jon that panic spreads faster than truth, unless somebody in charge keeps the room steady. And that is exactly what Jon becomes here. He is the still point, the one man who can look at a nightmare army and still think in steps instead of emotions. And that alone saves lives. A lot of them. Because in the original timeline, too much of the final war feels like people barely holding it together and praying plot armor pays rent on time. A Yoda-trained Jon brings more system into it, more discipline, more realism. He is not trying to look heroic. He is trying to make sure as few people as possible get sent to permadeath before sunrise. And while that war is happening, Daenerys becomes the second front of the real problem, because once the dead are on the field, her best traits and worst traits both get louder. She is brave, useful, powerful, all of that. But pressure also pulls out that dangerous belief she carries deep down, that history is waiting for her to command it. Jon would see that more clearly now than ever. He would notice the frustration when people hesitate to trust her. He would notice how fast disappointment starts turning into anger. He would notice that she talks about liberation, but she takes disobedience real personal. That does not mean he turns on her immediately. He is too smart for that. It means he starts planning for two endings instead of one. One where they beat the dead and build something better together. Another where they beat the dead and then have a whole new problem with silver hair and dragons. That is the kind of foresight Westeros almost never has, and it matters because it stops Jon from getting caught flat-footed when Daenerys starts sliding. Then you've got the reveal of his true identity hanging over all of this. And that is another place where Yoda changes the outcome. In the original story, Jon treats his parentage like one more burden to carry with a tragic face and a lot of silence. Here, he still feels the weight of it, but it does not own him. Yoda would have already taught him that identity is real, but it does not get to drive the carriage. So when he learns he is not Ned Stark's bastard, but Aegon Targaryen, he does not spiral. He does not suddenly start acting like destiny dropped a crown in his lap and now the world has to adjust. He stays centered. That is huge, because now Daenerys cannot use that revelation to emotionally corner him the same way. The Lords cannot project whatever fantasy they want onto him as easily either. Jon knows who he is already. The name changes. The man doesn't. And that makes him way more stable than everybody around him. Which leads straight to the biggest difference in this whole stretch. If Daenerys starts tipping toward tyranny, this Jon sees it earlier and responds earlier. He does not wait until a city gets sent to the gulag in 4K to realize maybe the Dragon Queen has some issues. He spots the pattern while there is still time to act. The obsession with loyalty, the wounded pride, the need to be loved and obeyed at the same time. Yoda would recognize that kind of fear-wrapped power from a galaxy away, and Jon would hear those lessons in his head every time Daenerys started confusing destiny with permission. So the ending of the war for the living turns into the setup for the last real choice Jon has to make. He has united the North. He has helped stop the dead. He has outgrown the shame that used to control him. Now the question is whether he can do the hardest thing of all, stand in front of one more powerful ruler he cares about, and refuse to let love, pity, or exhaustion blind him to what she is becoming. And that is where this whole theory lands. Yoda would not turn Jon Snow into some flashy fantasy Jedi, flying around Winterfell, tossing White Walkers into walls like furniture. He would do something way more dangerous than that. He would make Jon emotionally unplayable. And once that happens, the ending of Game of Thrones changes at the root. Because the final crisis in Jon's story was never just the dead, and it was never just the throne. It was always this question. When love, duty, identity, and power all collide at once, does Jon stay clear enough to choose the hard truth? Or does he let his heart drag him into another disaster? In the original story, he keeps surviving huge moments, but he is almost always late to understanding what those moments really cost. A Yoda-trained Jon stops being late. So when Daenerys reaches that edge, when the pressure, grief, entitlement, and destiny talk all start fusing into something ugly, Jon does not stand there shocked like, wow, I cannot believe the Dragon Queen with a messiah complex and family trauma is acting unstable. No, he sees it coming. That is the payoff. He sees it before the city burns, before fear becomes policy, before a ruler who wanted to free the world starts believing the world deserves punishment for not loving her correctly. And because he sees it early, he has options. That is what Yoda gives him more than anything else. Options. He can confront her sooner. He can draw firmer lines sooner. He can force the people around her to face what is happening, while there is still room to move. Tyrion gets less room to keep lying to himself. Arya gets less room to just watch the madness gather. Sansa gets proven right faster, but more importantly, Jon can finally do something his original self struggled with over and over again. Act before the emotional damage becomes a body count. That means this version of Jon is far more likely to stop Daenerys before she sends a whole city to the gulag. And if it still comes down to him having to unalive the woman he cares about to save the realm, then it happens differently. Cleaner, sadder, but cleaner. Not as a man finally waking up after the disaster. As a man who saw the disaster coming and refused to let love talk him out of reality. That is a brutal level of growth, but that is exactly the kind of growth Yoda trains into people. So what does Westeros look like after all that? Better led, first of all. More honest too. Jon still does not become some swaggering king who suddenly loves politics and silk outfits. That is not him. But he becomes the rare thing Westeros almost never gets. A leader who understands power without worshipping it, duty without turning it into self-punishment, and love without letting it become a leash. That makes him more qualified to rule than almost anybody in the story, which is funny because the man still probably looks at the throne like it is a cursed chair built by people with terrible conflict resolution skills. Maybe he takes it, maybe he refuses it and builds something looser, stronger, more northern, less obsessed with bloodline madness. Either way, the answer to the question is clear. If Yoda trained Jon Snow, Westeros gets a version of Jon who still has heart, still has honor, still has that same instinct to protect people. But now, all of it is guided by control, clarity, and timing. The White Walkers get handled earlier. The wildlings get integrated sooner. Cersei gets read correctly. Daenerys gets checked before she becomes the next apocalypse in a prettier outfit. And the North ends up following a man who does not need pain to prove he is real anymore. That is the real win. Jon Snow stops being a symbol of noble suffering and becomes a system breaker. The kind of man who can walk through prophecy, war, family secrets, dragon politics, and ice zombie chaos without losing himself. And brother, if Westeros had gotten one man like that at the right time, the whole game changes. So here is the thought that sticks with you. If Jon Snow had been trained by somebody who taught him how to master fear instead of just survive it, would the Seven Kingdoms finally have gotten their first true ruler? Or would they have rejected him the same way broken systems always reject the man who sees too clearly?